No, this isn't clickbait. My father died, and I am happy about it. I'm sure that will sound callous to some of you, but I'm going to explain. For those of you who are new here, my name is Autumn Beckman. Welcome. This is a very different video from the kind of videos I usually do, which are about luxury handbags. But the story I'm about to tell you is about an abusive parent, and about finding yourself in a position to make life or death decisions for that abusive parent. And this could be extrapolated to other people in your life with whom you have had similar kinds of relationships. Now, I'm not sharing this story for sympathy. I don't need that. I'm fine. I'm not looking to get comments about how sorry people am for my loss, because in this case, the loss is a good one. But the reason I'm creating this video is that I have dealt with some things in the last week that surprised me, and that felt like things that other people will also be going through but nobody really talks about. So I thought making a video and talking about it might help some people. If you have been a long-time subscriber of my channel, then you may remember that I have previously told the story of how I grew up and the role that my father played in that. Ultimately, it was not a good one. Those videos are still up. It's a 3-part video series from a long time ago. And if you hear this story and you're interested in hearing a lot more detail on it, then I will have those videos linked below, so you can check that out if you want. And I would skip over the story completely because I have already told it there, but in telling you what's happened in this last week, you really need to know some of the original story to put this last week into more context. So I'll keep this shorter than 3 videos, but I'm going to paint a little bit of a picture for you of what my childhood was like with him. My father was an international and an interstate drug dealer. So he would get marijuana from Mexico, he'd bring it into Texas where we are, he would distribute it there, but then he would also take it up to Michigan where he has family, and at least one of his family members there was working with him and would distribute up there. Now, most of that happened before I was born. I grew up knowing him as a long-haul truck driver, but ultimately, I ended up knowing him as a cocaine addict, a parent who chose not to work, and not only that, but lied to us all the time, accused us of things, tried to make us feel crazy for accusing him of stealing from us, which is what he was doing, while we were at school or at work. The stealing got so bad that I installed a deadbolt on my bedroom door, and I boarded up my windows in an attempt to keep him out. But it didn't work because he would just push the boards out of the windows and then put them back in once he got inside. And the hinges on my bedroom door were on the outside, so he just took the door off the hinges. The longer we went with him being unemployed and stealing from us, and my mother being the sole breadwinner in the family, not only supporting my sister and I and herself and him, but all the bills, the mortgage, the car payment, the groceries. The farther we got into that, the deeper we got into poverty. We often went without water or electricity. We didn't have a landline phone for many, many years. And our house was literally falling apart around us. We had pots and pans in permanent places on the floor to catch the rainwater that came in from the holes in the roof. We had entire walls that were completely, and I mean completely, covered in mold, and soft spots in the carpet where the floorboard had rotted underneath because the house flooded at one point and we were never able to get any repairs done. You couldn't make a sandwich on the kitchen counter without roaches coming out within a few seconds to get to your sandwich. And at night we could not only hear but see rats coming out and scurrying around the house. So that's a little bit of a picture for you of how I grew up. And all of that was because of him. And of course, there's a lot more to the story, including lots of emotional abuse. In 2004, some things went down and we sold our house. My mom and sister and I went off together to a house that she was able to buy, but my father became homeless, and he's been homeless for the last 20 years. I still kept in touch with him at that point for quite a long time, about 10 years, and I was the last person in the family who was still talking to him. And that's because I felt sorry for him and I remembered who he was before the addiction. But that's a luxury that I had and my sister didn't have because she was younger and she didn't remember him. All she knew of him was the addict. And sometimes over that 10 years, he was the version of himself that I remembered. And I visited him pretty regularly for a while. I got to see the various cardboard boxes he lived in. Sometimes I took the dogs to visit. Sometimes I took food to him. Sometimes I took him out to eat, usually to an all-you-can-eat place so he could get a lot of variety and as much food as he wanted. And of course, I paid for all that. And we actually had some really nice conversations over those years. I remember a few of them, where he made a genuine effort to be the father that he hadn't been in a really long time. And those moments were nice, and I'm glad that I have those memories. But then things changed. There came a day where he was upset with me about something. I had made a decision that was the best decision for me and for my sister, but he didn't like it. And he got angry with me. And in retaliation, he threatened to go up to my new job. I had just started my career teaching, and he threatened to get me fired. That he would do whatever he could to cause a fuss and say whatever he needed to say and get me fired, even though I had done nothing wrong. He had just gotten out of prison again. I don't know how many times he'd already been in. And if I remember correctly, this was a time where when he went in, he had a dog, and I went and got the dog and found the dog a home because he was going to be in prison for a while. So despite all this, he chose to behave this way toward me. Plus, while he was in prison this time, I kept getting phone calls from some woman who kept wanting me to get in touch with him in prison. And it turns out he had given my personal cell phone number to another inmate to give to his girlfriend, and that's the woman who was calling me. And it never even crossed his mind that there was anything wrong with that, or that doing that could even put me in danger, not to mention the violation of my privacy. But him threatening to get me fired from my new job was the last straw. For him to do that after everything he had already put me through, knowing what he had put me through, knowing how hard I had worked to go to school, get a handful of degrees, and start a career, all of which I was doing to better my life, which he had always encouraged me to do. And here he was, as I'm finding some success, trying to grab me and drag me back down. And in that moment, I was done. I wiped my hands of him and I never spoke to him again. And that was 10 years ago. He had ruined what he built. He was not about to ruin what I had built. That wasn't the last we heard from him, though. A few days later, he made the mistake of calling my mother, who at that point I had told her what had happened, and she laid into him, and she fiercely defended me against him. And that is something I appreciate from her to this day. But it still didn't end there. We also heard from him here and there throughout the years. There'd be a random voicemail, or even though we made every effort to stay as private as possible so he couldn't find any of us, he somehow knew when we were out of town, and we would get texts from him describing what our home looked like, or saying that he was petting the dog in the backyard, or saying that he liked a particular bumper sticker on my sister's car. Imagine trying to escape someone, trying to hide from them for years, and getting texts like that. So that's a taste of what the last 10 years have been like. Fast forward to last week. And this part of the story is why I'm making this video. This is the part that I think could help people who might be going through similar things. Just over a week ago, there was a knock on our door. It was a police officer. And immediately I assumed it was about him. I thought he was going to tell me that they found my father's body somewhere. But no, it couldn't be that easy. And I know that sounds very callous, but given what you've just heard, and especially if you go back and watch that 3-part video series that goes into much more detail, I hope it makes sense why I would not be particularly sad that he died. But he hadn't. He'd had a stroke. He was in the hospital. He couldn't make decisions for himself. And the hospital had been trying for almost 2 weeks to find his next of kin. And guess who that turned out to be? So I called the hospital. I spoke with a social worker and I spoke with a nurse. They said his condition was very serious and that they needed someone to make medical decisions for him. I told them both that we had been estranged for about 10 years. I told them why. And I told them that we wanted nothing to do with him and that the doctors should just do what they thought was best. They kept calling, though, and I came to the realization that the reason they were being so persistent is that they needed someone for legal reasons to make these medical decisions. And so to make their jobs easier, not to help him, I very reluctantly agreed to take that on. But I also made it very clear that we would have no responsibility for him financially, or for his care if he were to be released, for example, or for his body if he were to die. I never went to the hospital, but I did end up having to take 2 days off work to deal with phone calls related to this. And at this point, I feel like some people are going to be watching this and be like, oh no, the poor thing, her father's dying in the hospital and she had to take 2 days off work to make life and death decisions about his care. But if there is anyone thinking that, I would just refer you back to everything I just said. So I took 2 days off work to make these phone calls. The reason for that is, if you're not familiar with my channel, I'm a teacher, or at least I still was at the time all this was happening. By the time you're seeing this video, the school year will be over, and that was my last year teaching because I'm moving on to other things. But anyway, I could not take calls like this when I'm in a classroom full of 30 students. Even if the students had been quiet and I'd been able to hear on the call, these calls were long, the content of them was way too personal, and they wouldn't have been appropriate to have within earshot of anyone who wasn't, like, family, and certainly not in front of children. And even if they had been, the way these kinds of calls work is if they're calling you, you need to be available to answer immediately, because if you're not and you have to call back, then you have to wait for them to call you back, because a lot of the time, the doctors especially will not be available when you call, and it would take them several hours to get to a point where they were available to call me back. So to expedite the whole process, I had to be home and available with my phone on me at all times to be able to take calls as they came in. It turned out his stroke had been caused by a bacterial infection in his blood, and that had resulted in blood clots throughout his body. He had them in his heart, in his lungs, in his leg, and there was another infection in his spine. He couldn't walk. He was on a feeding tube. He couldn't remain conscious for more than 2 or 3 minutes. He could barely answer very simple questions and didn't seem to be there very much cognitively from what the doctor told me. I was told it was a complicated case and he had a team of doctors working on him. And I was told they wanted to install a filter of some sort that was to catch blood clots that might release and catch them before reaching his brain and causing another stroke, which could be fatal. And what they needed from me was my consent to do that procedure. So here's where things get tricky. And this is the part of the whole process that I'm really making this video about. Because it's the part of the process that for me I found the most difficult, the most surprisingly difficult even, and that people don't really seem to talk about. So I felt like it would be helpful to discuss this, tell you my experience with it, so that at the very least, if you're going through something like this, you know other people have gone through it too and had similar feelings about it. Or at most, it could potentially help you through this kind of process if you're going through it yourself. Or it could help you get some directives in place so that other people don't have to make these decisions for you. So I went from having washed my hands of him to suddenly having his life in my hands. I found myself in a position to decide whether this person, a person who caused so much trauma to my family, who abused us, who threatened us, who us, who was a drug addict, and who had been homeless for 20 years. Suddenly, I had to decide whether his life was worth saving, or whether I should, as it felt to me, make the decision to kill my father. Because that's how it felt. Talk about a curveball. I always thought that I would get a phone call or someone would show up at the door and tell me that they found his body. It never even occurred to me that I would find myself in this situation. And despite how I might be coming across to some of you in this video, I'm actually not a callous person. I'm actually very empathetic, and that should be evidenced in the fact that I was the one who stayed in touch with him for so long. So my response was not to just immediately say, pull all the care, let him die. He doesn't deserve to live. I didn't want to make a decision out of anger or trauma or revenge, and I didn't. I actually took time to think about it. This whole time I had been keeping my mom and sister informed, and we kept talking about what was going on. I kept talking to the doctors. I got more information. And ultimately what we decided would be the best and most compassionate decision, given his entire medical situation that we knew about, is that I would put a DNR in place, a do not resuscitate order, and that I would sign papers to put him into hospice, which did mean they would be withdrawing care. Not all care, of course, but if you're familiar with hospice. And once I gave the hospital this decision verbally, they took care of all that for me. By the way, I have to give a shout out to the social worker who was talking to me through all this. She was incredible. She was kind, she was respectful. She even acted a little bit like a therapist for me at times. At one point, I told her that I felt cold because I was very purposefully trying to be distant, and I kept repeatedly saying, "We want nothing to do with him." And she told me, "Oh no, you are just protecting yourself." And I knew that's what I was doing. And she said that she understood that because she had been through things, but that ultimately I should make the decisions that allowed me to sleep at night. And for me, whatever decision I would have made, I would have felt fine about. It was just the process of making that decision, feeling like you have someone's life in your hands, because you do, and especially doing that for someone with whom you do not have a good relationship. Not only that, but someone who was your abuser. To have their life in your hands is a very complicated thing. And again, that's why I wanted to make this video, because people find themselves in situations often, every day, where they're having to make medical decisions for loved ones, people they care about. But we don't often hear about having to make those decisions for people we want nothing to do with, people who hurt us very deeply. And I, again, wanted to be careful that if I did make the decision to pull care and not try to save him, that it wasn't because I thought his life wasn't worth saving, because who am I to say that for anyone, right? It doesn't matter if he's homeless and a drug addict. It's not my place to say whether or not that life is worth living. What I did want to do was make the decision that I thought would be the most compassionate one for that person. And considering his medical situation, which was already very bad, but also considering that even if he did recover to the point where he could be released, that he would be released back onto the street, and that there was nobody to care for him, and that there was no way for him to get any care he needed or have assistance that he needed. And what kind of life is that? We kept coming back as I talked to my mom and sister about this, about quality of life. Not the worth of life, but the quality. So moving on with the story, I got the DNR in place, decided not to do that filter that would stop a clot, because considering his situation, even if that stopped another stroke from killing him, what was his quality of life at that point? So I signed the papers to move him into hospice. And at that point I thought I was done. But then I got a call from his doctor that he was improving. And I tell you what, I didn't react like a decent human should. I was very disappointed that he was recovering. And it was for selfish reasons. It was because I felt like I just went through all of this, and for what? To have to do it again at another point in time? Because the doctor said at that point, when he made this phone call and told me he was doing better, he said it could still go either way, and it's probably gonna go the negative way. But he's doing better. He's a little more there cognitively, he's able to talk a little more, and there is a chance that he could recover to the point where he could make his own decisions. And as if what we hadn't already done was difficult enough, this felt like, okay, now we're on a roller coaster. It's this up and down, and what's next? And the doctor had called not only to tell me that, but also that they wanted to start him back on antibiotics for that infection in his blood. Now, he had already been in the hospital for about 2 weeks at this point. I had only known about it for a few days, and they'd had him on the antibiotics for most of that time, and he hadn't been responding. And the doctor said, if we put him on the antibiotics, we at least give him a chance. So now I'm in this situation again where I have to decide, do we give him a chance? I consented to it. They put him back on the antibiotics. And then the next day comes around and I had to fill out a ton of more paperwork for a different hospice because they had to move him for a number of reasons to a different place. He was still in the hospital this whole time. He'd never gone to the first hospice, but they weren't able to do that first one anymore, so they were having to do a different one, and it was a lot more paperwork this time. And I had to sign a second DNR for out-of-hospital resuscitation, whatever it's called. And to top it off, in case all this just wasn't enough, the hospice where they wanted to move him was the same place where my grandmother had been. Not my father's mother, but my mom's mother. Now, she died several years ago, so she's not there currently. They wouldn't have been there together, but it was the same place she had been. And it just so happened to be very close to where my mother lives. So close that it's on her route to and from work. So she would have to drive by him twice a day. So then I had the decision to make about whether to tell my mother that. So I called my sister, I talked to her, and we decided to go ahead and tell her. So I called my mom, I told her. She was surprisingly good with it. I thought it was going to be a real emotional burden, and maybe it would have been if it had ended up happening, but she took it really well. And we even talked about the possibility of visiting him, but both decided that that would be a terrible idea for a number of reasons. And not long after I hung up the phone with her, I got another call from the doctor to tell me that he had died. And my response was, okay, that's about it. So I called my mom back and I told her, and then I called my sister and I told her, and they had similar reactions. And our county is taking care of his body, cremating him. One thing I didn't expect is that once word got out in the hospital and all the entities that he had died, is that someone at the hospice and the chaplain at the hospital both called me. And they called to offer condolences, but also to let me know that they both had grief counseling services available for free if we needed them. We don't, but it is good to know that that's available for people who do. So I wanted to share that information so that you're aware of that as well. I don't know how common that is, but since two different entities offered that to me voluntarily, I would guess that it's pretty common. And I think that's a great thing that places have in place. So at the beginning of this video, I said that my father died and that I'm happy about it. And now that you know the story, let me clarify. I'm not happy in the sense that I'm joyful or that I'm celebrating, but I am happy that I will never have to deal with him again. I will never have him show up at my job and threaten to get me fired. I will never have him leave another voicemail out of the blue that shocks me back into the childhood that I have fought so hard to escape. I will never again have to find a home for another dog because he went to prison. I will never again visit him in prison, which I did quite a few times. And I'll never have my phone number given to another inmate. And I will never have to worry about him showing up at my home when I'm not there. And I will never have to see him walking through a parking lot out of town where I've gone to have dinner with friends, which happened once. I will never have to deal with him again. And neither will my sister, and neither will my mother. And that I am happy about.